was very excited with what we were speaking about just now, of where the translation is taking place today. If you could speak something more about that, what is translation today? And of course, I want you to tell why you were starting to ask yourself questions about translation. Of course, because you have translated, and maybe you feel as a translated person or living in translation. Speaking, yes, of this.
I think when one uses the word translation, then one is looking at, in English, because you know it's in the major North Indian languages, you have the Sanskrit type word, which is anuvad, following speech, or you have tarzama, which is from the Arabic Farsi, which is also a big source of loans for us. So to an extent, I would, before I even start talking about translation, I would want to undertake the impossible project of translating the word translation in all the languages of the world, going beyond its Latinity, I'm quoting. And so we all know translation is transference, etc., etc., but do we know the extent to which and we all know that Italian proverb about a translator is a traitor, but these are all Latinate words, right? So do we know what happens to the concept when they begin to inhabit other words? So therefore, when I talk about translation, I'm talking about an English word. As a teacher of English, because I love English, it's a very supple language, and I'm talking about what is done at universities, or what is done, in tertiary systems of education. That's what I'm talking about. So, and I think that should be done very well. I'm a literalist there. Like, I follow Aristotle in a very vulgar way. When Aristotle is teaching his creative writing class, poetics, where he's talking actually not theory, but he's talking to people who are going to write tragedies to win competitions. What does he say? He says, be very careful, very good with mimesis. And if poiesis happens, it will come by tuche, by chance there will be. So I think that is my formula here, that very careful literalism, in fact, will first of all bring equivalence anyway, because I'm a human being, I can't be perfectly literal, but also on the positive side, if I really hit it, it will bring something beyond literalism. So that's where I am with translation. I believe you wanted me, I'm sorry it's so long, because I didn't want to answer the implicit question. You wanted me to talk about creolization. That is not just today. That is something that has happened forever. That is a phenomenon, and that has nothing to do with translation studies as a discipline, nothing. Forever, the servant has learnt the master's tongue, not well, but well enough so that the master can understand and communicate. This is, in exogamy, the wife has learnt the in-law's tongue, etc. So in Vienna, I gave a talk where I talked about the wife in exogamy as the original diasporic. It's not, not theorized. And then the Victorians brought in, because courtly love has nothing to do with this, but the Victorians brought in love and so on. So, creolization is not something that's just happening today. It is at the source of all of the languages, grammatized languages of the world. It's happening all the time. And we should think of that very much more as a model in practice. I live in Washington Heights. I go into a grocery store and I creolize Spanish, because otherwise the grocer can't talk to me. I have more power than he, but in that situation, I'm a buyer. like a servant, right? He's the seller. And so if I don't realize the only language he speaks, I don't get served. So that's something that's been happening all the time. That's not something that's happening today. I just offered it because people seem completely blind to it as they talk about translation.
And there is a connection between this tendency that has always been existing between this tendency of creolization and translation?
Can be. Class mobility. The creolizer becomes, that text at the beginning of this, when Dante chooses the curial Creole, aristocrats speaking in court, out of all the Creoles. That's access to translation. It was written in Latin, the book, De Vulgari Eloquentia. And so, of course there is, but it's confined to class. And to an extent, the women become honorary males, as it were. My sister is married to a Hindi speaker. Our language is Bengali. My sister has a chemistry doctorate. She's just been nominated by the government of India in the spreading of science as the head of the advisory committee on gender and communication, and she's an extremely successful person. But she had to learn the language of her husband like a native. I love my brother-in-law, but his Bengali is not that good. So it's a question of class mobility, so it's not. And what connection is there? The same connection as Dante told us in the 13th century. One is one is between grammatized languages, and the other is other is a survival technique. So that's how I would connect them.
Something completely different. If you have something to...
I have so many questions.
Me too.
I guess I will ask one. You said you were in New York, and we're here in New York today. New York is a wonderfully diverse, multicultural, multilingual, multi-religious, very dynamic. And we're here on the 10th anniversary of 9/11. It strikes me as if the whole world is watching New York, how they move on and regenerate, commemorate and regenerate. You're also from Kolkata, which is also a wonderfully diverse, multilingual, international city with great filmmakers and dynamic political parties. And how does this multilingual translational environment of these cities, how does that contribute to or underscore or impact your scholarly thinking about translation?
You see, what happens is that my experience in the village schools teaches me how not to generalize when I'm at a place like this, because my cultural difference from them is greater than my cultural difference from you. They are Indians, So to an extent, I have a feeling that that's what informs me. In the beginning, this effort started not because I wanted to do anything, but because I was asked. I always wait for someone else to ask me, So I was asked, and I told my mom that, and I told my students, I said, look, and I'm self-subsidized, I'm not corporately funded. So I said, look, I would say to my students, Pittsburgh and Columbia, I love you, you're my students, but I need $1 salary in order to do this big challenge that, supplementing vanguardism. my greatest intellectual challenge. So my mind is not on teaching you. And I'm the child of plain living, high thinking bourgeois parents. So precisely because I don't want to work for you anymore, I feel that I have to work very well for you. So get your money's worth, you know, pay good attention to what I'm saying. But then as the years passed, I realized that at two ends of the spectrum, I was doing pretty much the same thing, because the children of the superpower need to have their desires rearranged just as much as subalterns who accept wretchedness as normality also need to have their desires rearranged. So I'm not like doing good to anyone. I mean, these people are not in any problematic situation. I'm teaching at both ends, okay? So therefore, I think that's what makes me tick. And I don't really see it as translating. I am with the language here. I don't just mean English, but the language of de-trivializing the humanities here. And I'm with the poetry of the decimal system there, because there's no science stream in those villages, and so these people can't get into the mainstream. So they're like two different idioms which I have tried to internalize in my own way and not really succeeded. I've not succeeded at this end. I've been kicked upstairs, and I've not succeeded at that end, because it's very hard to know what a subject is like after millennial cognitive damage. So that's how. It's not a real answer to your question. You had wanted a more ethnocultural answer, but for that you'll have to wait for my friend Homi.
Even if you say that the grounding problem is that it's not possible to translate, is it important still to translate as a political act, as you have translated Masveta Devi? Is it important? And you introduce, you explain, you accompany the translations with the explanation and so on. Is that a political important act to do?
I think it's losing its importance as the translators are talking more and more about how important they are. Because you know, Marcuse and Robert Paul Wolff's idea of repressive tolerance, Raymond Williams's idea of the oppositional being turned into just an alternative, that's what's happening with the powerful languages translating a lot of stuff. I think translation is inevitable. And I think, you know, as far as what I did, no, I would not say these are political gestures. They came from the only thing that was somewhat, not really political, but I wanted to not just supply quick ways of learning culture, because culture can't be learned. And very often writers are kind of obliquely related to their so-called culture of origin. So what I did, therefore, I gave annotation. But you know, in India, this terrible woman called Madhu something, I've forgotten her name luckily, editor or something of India Today, the Indian Time magazine, right, says the translation is excellent except for Gayatri Spivak sermonizing. See, so you think it's a political act, but the Indian upper class thinks, you know, the non-resident Indian, she should keep quiet. I mean, this is disgusting. So therefore, no, it wasn't a political act. It was just that I wanted these texts to be treated as texts for study rather than a quick way of learning culture without reading the history books. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So, no, I don't think they were political in any broad sense. They were narcissistic. I was, when I read Derrida, I didn't know who Derrida was. I ordered the book in 1967. I was 25 years old. You know, your wife knew me then. So I ordered the book out of a catalog. I read it, and I thought, my God, this is a fantastic book. And I thought, this guy is like an unknown guy. and I am a very young assistant prof. So what can I can't, I'll destroy myself if I write a book on this guy. You know, I thought I was being so practical. And also my chair said, Gayatri, what are you doing? You wrote a nice dissertation on Yeats. Why are you going off in the direction of this peculiar book? He also didn't know. So therefore, I wrote a query letter that was so innocent that the University of Massachusetts Press said yes. So that is hardly a political act, okay, number one. I said I won't translate unless I can write a monograph-sized introduction.
The introduction is brilliant.
It's now being translated into French as a separate document.
Brilliant.
I think that's so funny.
I
But
learned more about Freud in your introduction to dramatology than I learned from any of my journals.
how wonderful! You know what Paul Deman said when he was my advisor? So I wrote the introduction, and I sent it to him, and he said to me, Gayatri, this is 3 books. Why are you putting it into an introduction? And I said, well, because it is my introduction. But then Mahashita Devi, I started translating her because Yale French Studies and Critical Inquiry had both asked me to contribute pieces, Yale French Studies on French feminism and Critical Inquiry on deconstruction. And I was an idiot. You know, this is completely narcissistic stuff. I was 39 or something. And like a fool, and I think it had a very bad effect, my gesture. I mean, here I was, being allowed to step into the European enclosure, instead of which I said, how can this be? So, for the sake of my identity, I started translating Mahashita Devi. And then, you know, the years, what you call this politics? And then the years passed by, and I began to discover her feudality. And so with Chotimunda, I put an end to it. So this is just part of my life story. It's not seriously political. I think politics is more complicated. You know, there you influence the decision makers. You think anybody cares?
I ask a follow-up. You've just finished translating Amy Césaire's Season in the Congo. And there you have no introduction. Have your thoughts about the sort of presentation of a translation as a book for changed after the Davy experience, or is this a different publisher with different editorial rules, or a different audience for your book, or how?
You didn't hit the one word that I wanted. Different author. Different author. Aimé Césaire. I don't have to go forward to introduce him.
This is true.
I mean, he was himself so tremendously active within and beyond Negritude. Then his own political work in the Antilles, and then also all the wonderful writing on him. And so I didn't feel that I had to educate anyone in anything. And I do have a short paragraph called Words from the Translator.
Yes.
And for me, that part had to be said, because it was the dream of United Africa after Pan-Africanism, you know, just after decolonization, and Nkrumah's dream, Lumumba's dream. These were taken up by the others from within French imperialism, because Aimé Césaire, you see, this nation-state business, post-imperialism rather than post-colonialism, it was not nation-state. Aimé Césaire tried to imagine the Congo in the way that a Lumumba would see. And he also made it clear that it wasn't just the CIA or the UN withdrawing that killed Lumumba, but those Katangans within the Congo who wanted to go with general capitalism. Capital has no country, with their minerals, etc. They made it possible. So I did have one paragraph where I talk about how one should look at that dream, within which, in Nehruvian India, I was born. I mean, I was born before independence, but nonetheless grew up like that. So then I give the task of the introducer to Bashir Diagne, because I had said that failed. And I, who always thinks about double minds, forgot it because it was my own problem, right? And Bashir, my friend from the first row, without realizing, added that, and I said, good, Bashir is going to write the intro. So there is an intro, but it is written by Bashir Diagne, who is from Senegambia.